Time now for the KC Ingram Show on WSTU. The opinions expressed are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WSTU. WSTU does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WSTU. It's time to call in with your questions and comments at 220-9788, 220-WSTU. And now, here's KC Ingram.
Good afternoon. This is Richard Geisinger, and I'm sitting in for KC Ingram. A special thanks to Meridian Marina and Yacht Club for sponsoring KC's program. We're going to speak with Mark Perry today. Mark is the Executive Director of the Florida Oceanographic Society, serving in this position since 1978. Florida Oceanographic Society is a nonprofit organization established since 1964 and dedicated to inspiring environmental stewardship of Florida's coastal ecosystems through education, research, and advocacy. Mr. Perry is responsible for the developing and directing of the Society's education, research, and advocacy programs. He directs the building and expansion of the Florida Oceanographic Coastal Center on Hutchinson Island in Stuart, Florida, which includes regional aquariums, exhibits, and nature trails on the 57-acre site open to the public. Mr. Perry currently serves on the board of directors of the Everglades Coalition. He's president of the Rivers Coalition, and he was an active member of the Water Resource Advisory Commission, advising the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board and the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Task Force under the U.S. Department of Interior. Mr. Perry has testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Agricultural, Nutrition, and Forestry about the Everglades. He served as a panel member for the U.S. Congressional Briefing on Florida's Estuary Impacts, and also as a panel member for the Florida State Senate Select Committee on Indian River Lagoon and Lake Okeechobee Basin. Mr. Perry is the author and co-author of several publications and is active speaker to many scientific and community organizations, continuing to advocate for the protecting of Florida's ocean and coastal ecosystems. I'm surprised that Mark has time to be here.
Well, that concludes today's show.
So, Mark, welcome.
Glad to be here, Richard.
I wanted to talk a little bit today about the what's going on with the Lake Okeechobee system, and I really would like to start years ago and paint a picture for the listener as to what the environment was like before we started to develop around the lake, if you would, Mark.
Sure. Richard, back in the turn of the century, we were trying everything we could back in 1900 to drain Florida. We actually paid people to come down and drain the valueless swamp south of Lake Okeechobee known as the Everglades. So we would dig canals and ditches, and then in 1926 and 28 we had a really severe hurricanes that came across the state, no warning, and we lost a lot of lives around Lake Okeechobee. And that constituted starting the Herbert Hoover Dike around the lake to control that flooding around the lake and not let that happen again, so to say. But prior to that, the natural history of the system, the greater Everglades ecosystem, actually goes all the way to the headwaters just south of Orlando in what we call Shingle Creek. And there's three creeks that actually come together and form in the top of the Kissimmee Valley. And that's at an elevation of about 60 feet above mean sea level. Now, just kind of keep that in mind. That's the upper chain of lakes south of Orlando. They all kind of come together into the Lake Kissimmee at the head of the Kissimmee River. And the Kissimmee River used to meander down about 105 miles long, meander back and forth like a natural river system, and enter into the top of Lake Okeechobee. And that system had about a 2-mile wide floodplain. So whenever it got really, really wet, the river would expand out about 2 miles wide on either side. Well, what happened is that system would take about 6 or 8 months for that water south of Orlando to eventually reach Lake Okeechobee. The lake used to flood south. It used to overflow its banks to the south of the lake and down through this large expanse, about 30-mile wide, 100-mile long river of grass, and that's described by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And it's about 1 foot and 2 feet deep. It's a very slow-moving river of grass, and it would flow at about 1 mile every 4 days. So it took about 16 months for that water to actually flow all the way to the tip of Florida, into Florida Bay between the Keys and the tip of Florida. And Florida Bay received this beautiful estuarine water, clear, clean, fresh water, mixing with the ocean water, which formed this huge, one of the world's largest seagrass meadows. And it's just over 500,000 acres.
So this was a system that started right south of Orlando, if you looked at it as a system, and would go all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, all the way through the Everglades.
Yes, right.
Incredible. So what happened next that changed that system?
Well, as we were starting to drain it at the turn of the century, we wanted to get rid of the water. We actually dug the St. Lucie Canal too in 1916 to 1926, and we were trying to control the lake levels at that time. But when those two hurricanes came in the 1920s, it really caused the authorization of the Herbert Hoover Dike. And that's when we built this 35 to 40 foot high dike all around the lake, which stopped that river of grass to flow south. And then we redug the canals to the St. Lucie estuary on the east coast and the Caloosahatchee estuary on the west coast. And we channelized the Kissimmee River. We dug a C-38 channel right up the middle of the river, those oxbows, and overdrained that river. So instead of taking 6 or 8 months, it only takes 2 days. We get rain south of Orlando, and all that water flows immediately into Lake
So the
Okeechobee.
conclusion is we have now dirtier water coming into the lake, and we have no place to put it because of the dike on the south side.
Right.
Now, on top of that, the world found out that the fertility of the land on the south side of the lake was very productive.
Right.
And that changed the environment again, didn't it?
Right. So south of the lake, where that river of grass used to flow, is now a drier floodplain. And it became very advantageous to call that the Everglades Agricultural Area. So in 1930, the U.S. Sugar Corporation formed, and they were about growing sugarcane. And they have about 200,000 acres there. And then the Faneuil family moved up from Cuba in the late 60s, and they began to grow about another 200. So there's 467,000 acres of sugarcane in south of Lake Okeechobee. And it's very controlled as far as the elevation of water and for drainage and water supply in order to control that for that crop.
And that's the land that the water used to flow through to get to the Everglades, the River of Grass, right?
Correct. So consequently, the River of Grass is starving kind of the Everglades. And we've seen instances where Florida Bay was getting no fresh water and the salinities would go way beyond the ocean salinities. In fact, that hypersalinity caused seagrass die off. And then we would see times when it's too flooded and everything. And of course, the control, the engineering control of the lake was now dedicated to the east and to the west through the St. Lucie Canal and Caloosahatchee. So it was a very engineered system now to open those gates when we needed to discharge. And back then, you know, when they built the canals, they had no idea they were impacting these coastal estuaries that we know of as the St. Lucie estuary and Indian River Lagoon, which are so valuable to the marine resources. And
they didn't have the experience.
They had no idea how much impact it would do.
You know, it's interesting. When I talk to people, they don't understand how important the lake is and how important the Everglades is. And by doing a little research, the state of Florida has the second longest coastline in all of our states, second only to Alaska.
Right.
And on top of that, we are the second lowest state in the United States in terms of elevation. On top of that, we have most of our population on the coastal areas. So what does all that mean? It means that we're putting deep wells down along the coastline, which pulls in salt water, which means that the lake system, which is the basis of our fresh water, becomes more important because we're pulling all the salt water and because of the migration of people to the coast. On top of that, we are now the third most populated state in the United States, 22 million, and we're growing very rapidly, right?
Exactly.
So Mark, tell us where we are now in the process of I know that, you know, in our discussions earlier, this was known to be a problem back in the 50s. I can remember Ernie Lyons writing about it in the Stewart News. And I have to tell you, Mark and I have known each other for over 50 years. I hate to admit that, but anyhow, talk to us about where this started.
Old, Richard.
I know we're not that old, right?
But you're right. You know, we've known about the problem for many decades, and you know, the issues are trying to get the remedies into place. And you know, every political leaders and things that we have to convince, the agencies we have to convince that, you know, these are real issues and problems, and they're impacting our waterways. And when these discharges happen, it becomes very evident. And in recent times, of course, with since 2004, we started getting blue-green algae blooms that happened in Lake Okeechobee to be transferred with that freshwater discharge into the estuary, and it becomes very visual and very evident, in fact, very health concern to all of us who live in this community. So
Let me interrupt you just for a second.
concern.
Part of the problem with that, Mark, is that if we have water that's not clean coming into the lake,
Right.
it exacerbates those issues, right? And then the heat of the summer, and then it blooms.
Yeah, the algae is always there, but when you have too much nutrients to inflow of nutrients like you're describing from the north and into the lake, it just creates this bloom, this really growth of this algae, and that gives off these toxins and things that are really harmful to the environment. But it happens in a lot of different places, and we're over nitrifying and over nutrifying our environment by application of fertilizers and the activities we do mostly in agriculture or even in our septage or disposal of
so you have septic systems contributing
to,
and you have agriculture, and you have just drainage from
drainage. And the point of trying to get rid of that water fast and protect it for just flood control has now become a problem too, because we, as you mentioned, water supply. We need that water to naturally go south through the Everglades, because right in the middle of the Everglades is the top of the Biscayne Aquifer, which recharges all the lower East Coast. So the people in Hollywood, Miami, and other places in the lower East Coast, they depend on those wells you mentioned about being their water supply.
Right.
And in fact, the city of Hollywood had to spend an extra $10 or $12 million to move their well fields further west because that saltwater intrusion was coming in. It was drying up. And so we need to restore that kind of natural flow to the south and really stop that water from discharging to these coastal estuaries. As you mentioned, Florida is like got over 8,000 miles of linear shoreline and tidal shoreline around our areas. And we're very vulnerable to the ocean environment. And as it rises due to climate change and things, we're going to see more and more need to restore that hydrostatic pressure, if you will, back to that by putting fresh water back into the Everglades ecosystem.
So I've had people ask me, this is a pretty obvious problem. It's been an obvious problem since the 50s. Why haven't we been able to correct the problem? And my uneducated answer was that there are so many different hands into this thing, whether it's the Army Corps of Engineers, South Florida Water Management District, the state of Florida, the Indian reservations. I mean, everybody has the agricultural areas has some kind of a beef with us, with whatever we do. Yeah. And I think that's is that part of the reason why nothing has got, a real solution has not?
It's very difficult. You're right. It's what they call stakeholders. And we're all stakeholders who live around or interact with this water environment. And Florida is a water environment. And what happens is though we've advocated other uses for that and for that habitat, and we've unfortunately drained wetlands, or we've used wetlands and for fill, and we've basically had big agricultural activities, and we've put in big canals in order to be dependent on either the drainage and or water supply needs that are needed in these areas. Now those activities are becoming evident that are impacting other activity that we use. We want our waters, for instance, the estuaries and the Indian River Lagoon, to be the nursery grounds for our fish and shellfish and things that we desire. We want people to be attracted to the natural systems that are here. However, these discharges and things that are impacting them are because we're controlling the waters and managing the waters for other purposes, whether it's drainage or flood protection or navigation or even water supply. Those are things that we're managing the water for currently. So to get that to change and say, look, we ought to also consider public health and safety, or when we consider discharges, consider, how you're impacting the oyster reefs and seagrass beds that we value. We have to kind of continue to demonstrate that not only to the agencies, but also to the political leadership, because every couple of years, you have new political leaders with new agendas, and they come in and want to promote the economy or different kind of things. And we're saying, well, this is jobs in the economy right here. We have the cleaner, more healthier environment we can sustain, the more growth and economy we can sustain with those healthy ecosystems.
So I think everyone recognizing that this is the most important environmental piece that we have in the state of Florida, and we need to pay attention to it, and we need to get something done, right?
Right. And Lake Okeechobee is the heart of the system there. And it's kind of it's vulnerable too. And years back, we tried to save the lake because we were drowning it so much and killing off the littoral vegetation in the lake. And so we all shared that adversity and tried to let the lake be a lake again. And if we recognize that the natural systems can actually manage the water much better than we can if we just work with them and allow that to happen.
We should know that by now. Yeah. So breaking this up into components, we have a northern system, the Kissimmee Basin, if you want to call it that is putting water into the lake, and that's a natural thing. The water that's going in there is much more contaminated today than it was 100 years ago. Yeah. So one of the I guess the answers is to try and clean that water up before it gets in there. So there is work being done on that. I
Correct.
understand.
There's what they call the Lake Okeechobee Protection Act, which was actually passed in year 2000. And we were supposed to meet the maximum daily load of pollutants coming into the lake by 2015. Unfortunately, the state legislature in 2016 decided to change that and put it off for another 20 years. So we're not making headway that way, but there's 2.5 million acres of watershed around that Kissimmee Valley south of Orlando all the way down to the lake. And in that 2.5 million acres, you've got a lot of activity of ranchers or development or different things happening that we need to work with. And we need to really go into that watershed and all those sub-basins and try to work with those activities and say, let's curtail your water and get it all to the right level of those nutrients in order so by the time it gets to Lake Okeechobee, it'll be clean enough for the lake. And that's what they're trying to work on in that basic premise. But it's a very difficult process to try to get all those stakeholders in that watershed to work, just as it is in our watershed in the St. Lucie Indian River side or even on the Caloosahatchee side.
You got a combination of developments and ag.
Yep.
And so the good news is the Oxbow creating the Kissimmee what it was is almost finished, right?
That's right. One of the projects is the Kissimmee River Restoration.
Right.
And they've restored over 22 miles of that winding river. And where that happened, I've been up there in airboat and with Dr. Paul Gray from Audubon, and it is beautiful. It's restored back. There are alligators on the banks. There's fish back. There's all kinds of things. So we show that when we do restore these systems, it can not only produce the wildlife habitat that we think of, we can also see that it'll protect us. So that floodplain that I mentioned is now working. Like right now, we're getting these tropical storms coming through that drop a lot of rain in the valley. Now the river expands into that floodplain, and instead of just draining very quickly through
into
a canal, right down into the lake.
Okay, so that takes us to the lake. Now the lake, I understand there's been recent changes where they're bringing down the elevation of the lake. So that hopefully helps to discharges east and west. Is that correct?
Right. There's an operating schedule that the Corps of Engineers is allowed to operate in, and it can go down from 10.5 feet elevation up to 16.5 feet. And in that operating schedule, the Corps this year was trying to say, we know we need to try to get to 12.5 feet elevation by June 1st. They want to bring it down to the lowest point in preparation for hurricane season from June through November. So they were working at the beginning of the year to say, let's pulse release out some water. Let's get it down. And so by this time, June 1st, we're at 10.8 feet in elevation versus a year ago, we were at 14.2 feet.
Now, are there stakeholders that do not like that?
That is true.
Okay.
Recently, the stakeholders say we're too close to a water shortage, and we might create a water shortage situation if you drop below that line. And that's true, but that you want to try to get the lake to go low during certain times, and it's okay. In fact, it's good for the lake to go low once in a while, and then to allow it to increase during the rainy season. So right now, we're going to get several inches of rain coming across, and the lake will jump up pretty quickly. What happened, of course, last year when we started at 14.2 feet rather than 10.8, we were at 14 feet, and we got storms. It just jumped right up and to where it gets critical dike around the lake for safety. So the
Right.
Corps has to release the water out. So they were trying to be proactive and saying, let's get it down a little lower this year than we had in the past.
So then we have getting the water from the lake down to the Everglades. And where are we with that?
Well, that's we've finally gotten the project through the approval in Congress, which is called the Everglades Agricultural Storage and Reservoir. And that project is part of the Comprehensive Everglades Plan. And it's finally authorized through the 2018 Water Resource Bill. And now it's appropriated too. And Congress actually appropriated a record level of $200 million a year, as the state did $200 million a year, in order to match the 50-50 we need to implement these projects. And so we were able to put that storage reservoir south of the lake under fast track, and now it's going to hopefully, sure, it'll take years to construct and do, but they can, during that time we can also take a time to operate the lake better and put more water south during certain other times rather than just wait for this project to be done. So there's operational changes.
There's multiple steps that are being taken. We know it's going to still take a long time to get these plans actually constructed.
Big projects going,
but
right.
by keeping the lake lower, that really helps both the west and east coast estuaries, right?
Exactly. And the Lake Okeechobee schedule is under review now for a new Lake Okeechobee system operating manual by the Corps. And we've been participating in meetings. I encourage everybody to participate and to put your voice in as to how, that flexibility is needed by the Corps in order to operate the lake so that it's easy to operate at a lower level in preparation for these big storm events.
Well, my office is on the St. Lucie, and I can tell you that just watching the porpoises are coming. I mean, it's just it's a delight to see the river come back, and nature is incredibly resilient. But we have been putting it under a lot of pressure in the last 20 or 30 years, and I just want to thank Mark. Mark has dedicated the last 20, 30 years of his life to trying to clean up this system and understand it better. And Mark, if you would, just give us a little idea about the Rivers Coalition and how one would contact them and what they're about. And again, I just want to thank you for your dedication.
Yeah, you're real welcome. We have monthly meetings. The Rivers Coalition is a group we formed in 1998, and it was in response to all of that discharges. And it was not only environmentalists, but also business owners and chambers of commerce and others. We all got together and said the waterways are important to us. We had to fight for clean water in our river. And so monthly meetings are held. Go to riverscoalition.org. You can come to that. It's open to the public, and we give really good presentations and talks. We have the Corps of Engineers there. The Water District comes. We have scientists who give talks about the river and the issues. And so you get a real better understanding, and then also participate in some activities. Get out and help with an oyster bag deployment or a seagrass deployment. Help to restore these environments. It makes you feel better that you're working on it. And do whatever we can individually. If you're out in your boat, don't pollute the water, don't trash up things, do what we can individually and collectively to help keep pollution out of our waterways. And the third thing is just enjoy the water like you're doing. Just now is the time to get out there and see how beautiful it is and how this is the way we'd like to keep it all the time.
So you got a website for the Rivers Coalition,
it's riverscoalition.org.
Okay, and they can look it up, get involved, and the more grassroots effort we have, the better off we're going to be. We can all talk to our congressman and governor, and we do have a new governor, and he looks like he's helping this situation out. Is that correct?
He does. And right off the bat, in January 10th, he put out an executive order which really outlined several different things to do, and these steps are being taken, including funding. And it's just remarkable how he stepped up and begun to really take hold of what he's going to do. And we're fortunate to have that.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you very much for coming in today. I know you're a busy guy, and we want to thank you again for your work. And just want to let the listeners know that this Lake Okeechobee and Everglades situation is a critical one for the state of Florida. And I think the more people that we can get engaged in understanding it to begin with, and then letting our politicians know what they think would be a very helpful thing. So hopefully you go onto the website, get involved in the organization, and thank you again, Mark.
Thank you. All right. How do we do?
We done? We okay?